Welcome to Fearful Frequencies, where every story is a signal from the shadows. Tune in if you dare, and let the whispers of the unknown send chills down your spine. But beware, once you hear the haunting echoes of these tales, you may never listen to the silence the same way again. If you enjoy these stories, consider subscribing on Patreon at www.patreon.com/fearfulfrequencies. Link in description. So in the dead of night, when the world is silent and shadows grow long, there are frequencies that tap into our deepest fears. Gather yourself and listen. This story is called The GOATMAN Experiments Part 2, Revival. It's been 3 years since that night in the woods when the GOATMAN hunted us down. I still wake up in cold sweats, haunted by the memories of that beast. Its dead, lifeless eyes, the sharp, almost human-like smell of wet fur and decay, and the guttural growls that twisted the air around us. I haven't seen my old friends since then, and every day that passes feels like one step further into a nightmare that I can't wake up from. Mike was different after that night. He was always the tough one, the one who never backed down, never showed fear. But something broke in him after what we saw. The first few weeks after our escape, he barely spoke. He wouldn't leave his house, and when he did, he'd flinch at every noise, every shadow. I'd visit him, trying to keep things normal, but Mike was a shell of the brother I knew. His eyes were sunken, dark circles rimmed with sleepless nights and memories he couldn't shake. Eventually, he started seeing a therapist. Dr. Langford was a calm, older woman with an office that smelled of lavender and old books. Mike wouldn't tell me much about their sessions, but I could see the toll it was taking. He'd come out of those appointments pale, his hands shaking. The nightmares were bad, he'd say. Always the same. The GOATMAN standing at the edge of his bed, its eyes glimmering in the dark, its mouth opening too wide to reveal too many teeth. And always the smell, rotting meat and something sharp, like copper. Dr. Langford suggested Mike keep a journal, a way to document his thoughts and try to make sense of what he'd experienced. It started as therapy, a way to process his trauma, but it quickly became an obsession. Mike filled page after page with drawings, notes, and fragmented memories. The more he wrote, the more obsessed he became with finding out what the GOATMAN really was. It wasn't just a creature to him. It was something ancient, something evil that had been waiting in the woods long before we ever stumbled across it. Mike's research led him deep into the world of folklore, local legends, and unsettling histories that spanned centuries. He found references to the GOATMAN in obscure texts, hidden in the margins of old newspapers, and buried in the forgotten corners of online forums. There were stories of similar creatures from different cultures, beings that lurked in the woods, taking the forms of men and animals, drawing power from fear and violence. In some Native American legends, Mike discovered a creature called a Wendigo, an evil spirit that could possess people, driving them to madness and cannibalism. Other sources hinted at demonic entities, shapeshifters that wore the skins of their prey like trophies. But it was one particular tale that caught Mike's attention, a story dating back to the 1800s, told by early settlers in Maryland. They spoke of a half-man, half-goat figure that haunted the forests, stalking anyone who ventured too far from the safety of their homes. The creature was said to have been born from a deal gone wrong, a pact between a desperate man and a darker force. The man, seeking vengeance against those who wronged him, was cursed to live as the very monster he sought to unleash. Mike's obsession grew. He spent hours at the local library digging through old books and microfilm. He'd visit historical societies, ask questions that made people uneasy, and even tried to track down family members of those who'd disappeared in the woods. I could see it taking a toll on him. He looked older, worn down by the weight of what he was uncovering. But he wouldn't stop. He couldn't. He found police reports of missing hikers, detailed accounts of mutilated bodies found in the woods, and autopsy reports that described injuries unlike any animal attack. Deep lacerations that looked more like they'd been made by claws rather than any blade, and bones shattered in ways that defied explanation. Some of the files were heavily redacted, with large sections blacked out as if someone, somewhere, wanted to keep the truth hidden. One night, Mike called me over to his apartment. His living room had been transformed into a makeshift war room, walls covered in maps, photographs, and newspaper clippings connected by a web of red string. He was hunched over his laptop, furiously typing as he scrolled through page after page of online forums dedicated to urban legends and cryptid sightings. "Matt, you have to see this," he said, his voice tinged with a manic excitement that both worried and intrigued me. He pulled up a grainy video taken by a hunter's trail camera, dated just a few weeks before. It showed a figure, tall, hunched and covered in matted fur, moving awkwardly through the trees. Its legs were wrong, bending at unnatural angles, and its head was obscured by shadow, but the shape was unmistakable. The GOATMAN. Mike played the video on loop, pausing on a frame where the creature turned, revealing its eyes. Even through the pixelated image, I could see the darkness in them, like staring into an abyss. Mike leaned back, running his hands through his hair. "It's still out there," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not just a story, Matt. This thing, it's real, and it's getting closer." He showed me other evidence he'd found, eyewitness accounts, audio recordings of guttural growls echoing in the night, and a bizarre series of photographs taken by a hiker just before he disappeared. The photos showed the woods at dusk, empty and serene, until the last image. A blur of movement, something charging toward the camera, too fast to make out. It looked like a man, but wrong, distorted. I could see it in Mike's eyes. He was desperate for someone to believe him, to validate what he'd seen, what he was feeling. And I did believe him. I knew he wasn't crazy because I had seen it too, and every piece of evidence Mike presented only solidified the truth I'd been running from. The GOATMAN wasn't just some legend. It was a living nightmare that was still hunting, still waiting for us to come back. It was late when we finally talked about going back. Mike had been drinking, more than usual, and his normally controlled demeanor was slipping. He looked at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "We have to go back, Matt," he said, his voice strained. "I can't just sit here and do nothing. It's out there, and it's killing people. We have to find it, prove it exists. Maybe then we can put an end to this." "Mike, this isn't a game," I said, my own fear bubbling to the surface. "We barely got out alive last time. What makes you think we can handle it now?" He slammed his fist on the table, sending a stack of papers fluttering to the floor. "Because we have to. I can't keep living like this. Every time I close my eyes, I see that thing, feel its breath on my neck. We need answers, Matt. I need answers." I looked at the scattered papers, the photos of the GOATMAN, the grainy videos, the torn newspaper clippings that painted a picture of something old and hungry. Mike's obsession had taken over his life, and I realized then that he wasn't just searching for the GOATMAN. He was searching for closure, for some way to make sense of the horrors we'd lived through. After a long silence, I nodded. "Okay, we'll go back. But we're doing this right. Preparation, gear, everything. No mistakes." Mike's expression softened, relief washing over his face. "Thank you, Matt. I know it's asking a lot, but I need to see this through." We spent the next few days planning every detail. Mike gathered maps of the area, pinpointing the locations of previous sightings, strange occurrences, and places where people had vanished without a trace. Rachel's old contacts from the EMT world provided us with supplies, first aid kits, flares, radios, and other gear we might need if things went south. We armed ourselves with everything we could think of. Knives, bear spray, even a few makeshift weapons Mike had rigged up in his workshop. He was taking no chances this time. We set off early in the morning, the sky still dark as we drove down the winding roads of Prince George's County. The trees loomed tall on either side, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Mike was quiet, his focus entirely on the road ahead, while I kept checking our gear, making sure we hadn't forgotten anything. The anxiety was eating at me, the fear that this could be the last time we'd see anything resembling normalcy. Rachel's absence weighed heavily on us both. She'd been the practical one, the one who kept us grounded when things went south. Without her, it felt like a piece of our armor was missing, a gap in our defense that the GOATMAN could exploit. I didn't say it, but I knew Mike was thinking the same thing. We parked near the old fire road, the same spot we'd used last time. It was overgrown now, weeds and shrubs reclaiming the path, as if the forest was trying to swallow any evidence of our previous visit. Mike pulled out his maps, checking our route one last time before we set off. The trail was rough, barely recognizable under the thick layer of fallen leaves and mud. Every step felt heavy, each crunch of a twig underfoot sending a jolt of unease through me. Mike led the way, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. He was determined, driven by the need to confront his nightmares head-on. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the only sound our own footsteps, and the occasional rustling of leaves as some unseen creature scurried away. But even the animals seemed to be avoiding us, keeping their distance as if they knew something was wrong. The deeper we went, the thicker the air became, heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something old and rotten, like the forest itself was sick. We reached the cabin just before dusk. It looked worse than I remembered, the roof partially collapsed and the walls sagging as if they were struggling to hold themselves up. Mike approached cautiously, checking for any signs of recent activity. There were none. It was as if the place had been frozen in time, waiting for our return. Inside, the air was stale and suffocating. The faint, sickly sweet smell of rot clung to everything, stronger than before. The walls were covered in new drawings, fresh and frantic. They depicted figures, people with distorted faces, limbs twisted at impossible angles, their eyes wide with fear. In each drawing, the GOATMAN loomed over them, its form shifting and amorphous, never the same twice. "What the hell is this?" I whispered, running my fingers over the scratched lines. Mike stood beside me, his expression unreadable. "It's like it's been watching," he said, his voice barely audible. "Like it's been waiting for us." We moved deeper into the cabin, the floorboards creaking under our weight. Every step felt wrong, like we were trespassing in a place that didn't want us there. Mike led us to the basement door, the one that had haunted my dreams since our last visit. It was open, the darkness beyond swallowing the weak light from our flashlights. Mike hesitated, his breath hitching as he stared into the abyss. "It's down there," he said. "I can feel it." I wanted to turn back, to run and never look back, but Mike was already descending the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. I followed, the smell growing stronger with each step. It was rancid, thick and cloying, a mix of wet fur, blood, and something almost chemical. We reached the bottom, our flashlights sweeping over the room. The blankets were still there, shredded and scattered, but something else caught my eye. Symbols, scrawled in what looked like dried blood, covered the walls. They were crude and disjointed, resembling no language I recognized. Mike moved closer, his hand trembling as he traced one of the markings. "It's some kind of ritual," he said. "A summoning or a binding. I've seen similar things in some of the old texts I found, but this is different." Before I could respond, a noise cut through the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the far corner of the room. We turned our flashlights toward the sound, and that's when we saw it. The goatman crouched low, its back to us as it scratched at the floor with long, twisted fingers. It was muttering to itself, low and guttural, the words incomprehensible but filled with malice. Mike raised his weapon, but the creature turned before he could act. Its face was different this time, more human, but horribly wrong. The skin was stretched too tight, the eyes sunken and empty, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. It stood slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with its strings tangled. The smell hit us full force, a nauseating wave that made my head spin. The goatman took a step forward, sniffing the air as it eyed us with a twisted curiosity. Then it spoke, its voice a warped mimicry of Rachel's. "You came back," it said, the words drawn out, distorted. "You always come back." Mike's face went pale, his grip tightening on his knife. "That's not possible. You're not her." The goatman tilted its head, mocking us with a smile that stretched too far. "You left her," it whispered, the voice shifting to mimic Mike's, filled with accusation. "You left her in the dark." Mike lunged, slashing at the creature, but it moved too quickly, dodging his attack with unnatural agility. It laughed, a horrible, grating sound that echoed off the walls. The creature's form shifted as it moved, its limbs elongating, bending at grotesque angles as it taunted us. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering as the goatman lunged toward me. It was fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen, and I barely managed to get out of the way. Mike charged, slashing wildly, and for a moment I thought he'd managed to hit it. But the goatman twisted, contorting its body in ways that defied logic, and struck back, sending Mike crashing into the wall. The basement filled with the sound of our struggle, grunts, snarls, the wet sound of claws scraping against flesh. I grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and swung with all my strength, connecting with the creature's side. It let out a howl, but it was more of a mocking cry than one of pain. The goatman's eyes flickered, and for a split second, I saw something familiar in them. Something human. "Matt, get out!" Mike shouted, his voice strained. He was bleeding badly, his arm hanging limp at his side. The goatman was on him in an instant, clawing at his chest, tearing into his flesh with a viciousness that was almost gleeful. I grabbed Mike, dragging him toward the stairs, but the creature was relentless, its laughter echoing as it stalked us. We stumbled up the stairs, each step a battle against the goatman's grasp. It was right behind us, its breath hot on our necks, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me. We burst through the basement door, slamming it shut just as the creature's claws scraped against the wood. The cabin shook with the force of its rage, the walls trembling as the goatman pounded against the door. We didn't wait to see if it would break through. We ran, tearing through the woods with the creature's distorted voice chasing us. "You can't run," it called, its voice warping between Mike's, mine, and Rachel's. "You can't hide." We reached the road, collapsing against the truck as we gasped for breath. Mike was pale, his wounds severe, and I scrambled to get him into the passenger seat. The goatman's voice echoed through the trees, its taunts growing fainter but never truly gone. As we sped away, I looked back, and for a brief moment I saw it standing at the edge of the woods, watching us with those dark, empty eyes. It raised a hand, waving slowly, almost as if it were saying goodbye. Or maybe it was a promise that it wasn't over. Mike spent weeks recovering in the hospital. His injuries were severe, but the doctors were more concerned about the psychological trauma. He'd wake up screaming in the middle of the night, claiming the goatman was there, standing at the foot of his bed. They said it was PTSD, but I knew better. The creature had left its mark on him, and it wasn't going to let go. I visited him every day, trying to be there for him like he'd been there for me. But Mike was slipping away, retreating further into his own mind. He'd talk about the GOATMAN as if it were still with him, haunting his every thought. He was convinced it was coming for us, that it wouldn't stop until it had finished what it started. The doctors suggested more therapy, but Mike refused. He'd spend hours staring at his old research, poring over every detail as if he were searching for something he'd missed. One day he pulled me aside, his eyes wild with desperation. "It's not just one," he said, his voice hoarse. "The GOATMAN, it's part of something bigger. It's not just a creature, it's a curse, a manifestation of something dark and ancient. It's feeding off of us, off our fear, and it's growing." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to believe that we could just leave it behind, that we could move on and forget. But deep down, I knew Mike was right. The GOATMAN was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Mike kept researching, diving deeper into the legends and folklore, trying to find a way to end the curse once and for all. He found stories of similar creatures, beings that thrived on chaos and fear, that could take on any form they desired. There were hints of rituals, ancient practices meant to banish such entities, but they were incomplete, fragmented pieces of a puzzle we were just beginning to understand. One day, Mike called me over with a frantic urgency in his voice. He'd found something, a handwritten journal dating back to the late 1800s, buried deep within an archive of forgotten documents at the local historical society. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Chambers, a reclusive trapper who lived near the very woods we'd ventured into. His entries were filled with ramblings about a creature that stalked the night, a beast that wore the faces of men but was anything but human. Elias wrote about how he first encountered the creature while hunting. At first, it appeared as a lost man, begging for help in a distorted, almost mocking voice. But when Elias got closer, he realized its eyes were hollow and its movements were wrong, disjointed, like a marionette with tangled strings. He shot at it, but his bullets did nothing. The creature laughed, mimicking his own voice back at him. Over the following weeks, Elias documented how the creature began to torment him, appearing outside his cabin at night, scratching at the windows, whispering in voices that sounded like his dead wife. The final entry was the most disturbing. It detailed a ritual Elias attempted, an attempt to trap the creature using symbols and a circle of salt mixed with blood. He wrote about chanting old incantations, words that had been passed down to him from stories his grandfather told of ancient evils. The last lines of the journal were shaky, almost illegible. "It's not enough. It's never enough. It's inside the walls. It's inside me." Mike was convinced that this journal held the key to understanding the GOATMAN and possibly stopping it. But as we read and reread the entries, we realized that Elias's desperate measures were flawed. He'd only succeeded in angering the creature, binding it closer rather than driving it away. "What if this is just the beginning?" Mike said, staring at the pages, his voice trembling. "What if the GOATMAN isn't just one entity, but a part of something much larger, something that can't be killed or banished? Something that's been feeding on the fear of this place for centuries?" I didn't have an answer, but the thought of it chilled me to the bone. We were dealing with something beyond our understanding, a presence that couldn't be reasoned with or defeated by normal means. The GOATMAN wasn't just a creature, it was an embodiment of the forest's darkness, a manifestation of all the fear, pain, and death that had seeped into the land over generations. Despite our growing fear, we knew we had no choice. If we didn't confront the GOATMAN, it would keep coming, keep killing. Mike proposed one last trip into the woods, a final attempt to confront the creature and end its reign of terror. This time, we'd use everything we'd learned, the symbols, the incantations, and whatever knowledge we could glean from Elias's journal. We prepared meticulously. Mike created a mixture of salt, ash, and animal blood based on the ritual described by Elias. He carved protective symbols onto wooden stakes, believing they might serve as some sort of barrier. We armed ourselves with weapons, though we both knew they might be useless against a creature that defied nature itself. The drive back to the woods felt like a march towards certain doom. The sun was setting as we parked near the fire road, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and reach for us. Mike's resolve was unwavering, but I could see the fear in his eyes, a fear that mirrored my own. We were stepping into the lair of a predator that knew us, that had hunted us before, and it was waiting. The woods were silent, the air thick with anticipation as we made our way toward the cabin. Every step felt heavy, like the forest was closing in around us, watching, judging. Mike led the way, carrying the ritual supplies with a grim determination. I followed, clutching my flashlight and a hunting knife, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin was just as we'd left it, abandoned and decaying, but now it felt more alive, like it was breathing along with the forest. The symbols we'd seen before were more vivid, almost pulsing with a malevolent energy. As we stepped inside, the temperature dropped, and the air grew thick with the stench of rot. "We set up here," Mike said, laying out the supplies in the center of the room. He drew a large circle with the salt mixture, surrounding it with the wooden stakes marked with symbols. I watched nervously, my hands shaking as I helped arrange everything according to Elias's notes. "We only get one shot at this," Mike continued. "If it works, we might be able to weaken it, trap it long enough to, I don't know, do something. But if we screw up—" A noise cut him off, a low growl echoing from the basement. We both froze, our eyes locked on the darkness beyond the open door. The sound was familiar, yet twisted, like the GOATMAN was mocking us, playing with us. Mike grabbed a flare and ignited it, tossing it into the basement. The flickering red light illuminated the steps, casting dancing shadows that made the room feel even more claustrophobic. Then we saw it. The GOATMAN stood at the bottom of the stairs, hunched and twitching, its eyes reflecting the red glow of the flare. It was taller than before, its limbs longer, more contorted, as if it had grown in our absence. Its face was a patchwork of skin, shifting and changing, sometimes looking like Rachel, other times like me or Mike. It was wearing us. The creature's mouth opened and a chorus of voices spilled out. Rachel's screams, Mike's frantic shouts, my own cries for help. It was speaking in a cacophony of stolen sounds, blending them into a nightmarish symphony that made my blood run cold. Mike stepped forward, holding up one of the stakes. "Get back," he said, his voice firm but trembling. "Stay inside the circle." The GOATMAN laughed, a horrible wet sound that echoed through the cabin. It stepped closer, testing the edge of the salt circle. I could see the symbols flicker, almost like they were burning faintly in the dark. For a moment the creature hesitated, but then it lunged, slashing at the barrier with its claws. The circle held, and the GOATMAN recoiled, snarling. Mike began to chant the words from the journal, his voice shaky but growing stronger with each repetition. I joined in, though the words felt foreign on my tongue, ancient and powerful. The GOATMAN shrieked, thrashing against the invisible wall, its form flickering like a dying flame. It was working. Elias's ritual was working. But then something went wrong. The cabin began to tremble, the walls creaking and groaning as if the entire structure was about to collapse. The symbols on the stakes flared brightly, then faded, one by one. The salt circles started to dissolve, seeping into the floor as if the forest itself was rejecting it. "Mike, what's happening?" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "I don't know," he yelled back, his eyes wide with terror. The GOATMAN was grinning now, its body shifting and warping, feeding off the energy of the failing ritual. The air was thick with the smell of burning flesh and sulfur, choking us as the creature grew stronger. In a final, desperate attempt, Mike lunged at the creature with a stake, driving it deep into its chest. The goat-man screamed, a sound that shook the very ground beneath us. But it didn't die. Instead, it grabbed Mike, lifting him off the ground with an inhuman strength, and slammed him into the wall. I rushed forward, trying to pull Mike away, but the goat-man's grip was unbreakable. It stared at me with those empty eyes, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It whispered in Rachel's voice, soft and venomous, "You can't save him." I swung my knife wildly, slashing at the creature's arm, and it finally released Mike, tossing him aside like a rag doll. We stumbled back toward the door, our bodies aching, our minds reeling. The goat-man didn't follow. It stood in the center of the cabin, watching us with a predatory calm, as if it knew we were already defeated. We fled the cabin, the sounds of the goat-man's laughter echoing in our ears as we crashed through the underbrush. Mike was barely conscious, his breathing ragged and pained. I half-carried, half-dragged him toward the truck, every step a battle against the weight of fear and exhaustion. The sun was rising as we reached the vehicle, casting a faint light over the landscape. For a moment, I felt a fleeting sense of relief, like we'd escaped the darkness of the woods. But when I looked back, I saw it again, standing at the edge of the trees, just watching. The goat-man raised one hand, not in threat, but in a slow, deliberate wave. It was taunting us, letting us know that it would never be over. We drove in silence, the road winding back to civilization, but I knew we'd left a part of ourselves in those woods. Mike was in bad shape, his wounds worse than we realized, and I took him straight to the hospital. The doctors patched him up, but there was nothing they could do for the mental scars. He wouldn't talk about what happened, not even to me. He just stared at the ceiling, lost in thoughts I couldn't reach. The goat-man was still out there, lurking in the shadows, wearing our faces, feeding on our fear. And I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before it found us again. Mike's research, the rituals, the symbols, it had all been futile. The goat-man was more than a monster. It was a curse, an eternal presence that thrived on those who dared to confront it. As the days passed, I started to hear things, whispers in the night, soft scratches at my window. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination, the residual fear playing tricks on me. But then, one night, I woke up to find my bedroom door slightly ajar, the faint, unmistakable scent of wet fur lingering in the air. I knew then that we hadn't escaped. The goat-man was still hunting, still watching. It had followed us home, and it was only biding its time. Mike and I had tried to stop it, but we'd only scratched the surface of something far more ancient and malevolent than we'd ever imagined. The rituals were incomplete, the symbols flawed, and the goat-man knew it. It was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. As I sat in the darkness, listening to the soft, almost human sounds drifting through the night, I realized that the hunt was far from over. The goat-man wasn't just a creature, it was a living nightmare, and it was never going to let us go. And one day it would come for us again.